finished up Hebrews last week. And so since this is the first of the month, we're going to be touching on the Torah portion. And just coincidentally, completely just by accident, it just happens to be like one of my favorite Torah portions. And it just happens to be one that kind of kicked off our journey in taking a really close look at Jacob. And it's the birth of Jacob and Esau. And it's really because we misread Jacob so much, we misread his character so much that most of us in our culture, we don't catch the overall lesson that's in this contrast between Jacob and Esau. And so it's been a while since we've gone through this, so some of y'all may have heard some of this before, but hopefully looking at it in just a different way. But it's really there. The two nations that it talks about here represent the two ways of life. And the two ways of life that exist on the planet even right now. That we have to choose and decide who we're going to be. So he starts off, says these are the genealogies of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham fathered Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took for himself Rebekah, the daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, the sister of Laban the Aramean, to be his wife. And Isaac prayed to Adonai on behalf of his wife because she was barren. And Adonai answered his plea, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. But the children struggled with one another inside of her, and she said, if it's like this, why is this happening to me? So she went to inquire of Adonai. So Isaac, he's 40 years old when they get married. Y'all remember how old he is when the twins are born? 60. Well, that's when she becomes pregnant, when they're born. So it's 20 years of wondering, 20 years of struggling with what is apparent barrenness. And like so many, during a first pregnancy, I wouldn't know anything about that, but you don't necessarily know what's going on. Every little thing and every little twinge is like, what was that? I don't understand it. There's fear of every little problem. There's fear of having gone so long. I hope that this is not the start of a miscarriage, or all the other kind of things that can go through your mind. And so, why is this happening to me? That's a pretty natural reaction. The King James puts it, why am I thus? Or the Complete Jewish Bible translates this phrase as, why go on living if it's going to be like this? Some of you ladies have probably had that thought. Is it going to be like this all the time? Is it going to be all this kicking and this fighting? Yes, in a lot of ways it is. Because of what Adonai says, what these two represent. She said, Adonai, the Lord, answered her prayer. She went to inquire of him, and he answered. He says, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from your body will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other people, but the older will serve the younger. So it's 2 nations and 2 peoples. They're separated. That's not just talking about birth. They're separated in their personalities. They're separated in just about everything about them. They are going down different paths, and they are taking different roads. They represent 2 different ways of life. Ways of life that are really in conflict with one another. And we don't understand the lesson of what this sequence and this passage is talking about for several reasons. One, we misunderstand one of the characters. We've been taught Jacob all wrong. And secondly, we think of strength only in terms of physical strength. We actually think the stronger one is Esau. And that's debatable, whether he's stronger in body, really. We kind of wonder about that, because the only feats of strength in this account, in this sequence, there's 2 of them, and both of them are Jacob. The feat of strength where he moves the stone over the well by himself. And the The second one is he wrestles or he struggles with someone, right? Someone that you shouldn't really have a chance against. So there are two tests of strength in this, and Jacob shows to be strong. But really, we should also understand that this is strength of character and strength of morals. And with the way we typically read this account, we don't think either of them is very strong in character or morals. And when you come to Rebecca, as mom, as she's getting this message, all she knows is they were struggling. They were pushing and fighting against each other. They were incompatible. Their nature, their personality, their life choices were in conflict even before they were born. They were responding to the path that God had laid out before them, much like John the Baptist was responding when Mary shows up. He leaps within the womb at the coming and the arrival of Messiah. These boys are responding and reacting already to where they're going in life. But she didn't know all that. She didn't know even which one's going to be which. She didn't know which one the older son and the older one would be at first. She didn't know which path the younger one would take. It says, when her time came to give birth, indeed, there were twins in her womb. Now, the first came out reddish. All of him was like a fur coat, and they named him Esau. And afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding on to Esau's heel, and so he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when he fathered them. That's where we understand that they were waiting for 20 years. So the first one, he comes out reddish with hair all over. And I know we've talked about this before, but in the biblical world, though there's two colors have significant meaning. There's the color blue, right, which appears a lot in the priestly outfits and things like that. It represents what issue or what direction or what area of the universe. It's the sky above, is the color of the atmosphere. It's also representative of heaven or the heavens above. The other color is the color red. And it represents what? It represents the earth. Yeah. It's the physical world that we humans inhabit. So one represented the ways in the life of God, while the other represented the ways in the life of man, particularly fallen man. And what color is Esau? He is the color of man. He is the color of this earth. And so these two nations have existed. This division, these two ways of life, those have existed from the very beginning. Those have existed since Cain and Abel. And the sons of Cain, they followed after him with his perspective, his way of life, his anti-God lifestyle. So that while Seth and his sons followed in the ways of God. And they've been at war ever since. The sons of Cain, were essentially the sons of their father, the devil, will always try to seek out and attack the sons of Seth, the sons of God. And they did that until only Noah and his sons were left. So this battle is the one that Scripture continually frames as the call for God's people to distinguish things between light and dark, between the clean and the unclean, between the sacred and the secular, between the holy and the profane. That's the way of life. Those are the choices that we have. That's the paths that we can be on. And these two, Jacob and Esau, represented those paths. The priests and the Levites, they're supposed to be the ones that exemplify this way of life. They're supposed to be also the ones that teach it to the other Israelites. They're supposed to be the example for the whole world. The Israelites are supposed to be that for everybody, for the light to the Gentiles. He says you are to make a distinction between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean, and you are to teach B'nai Israel all the statutes which Adonai has spoken to them through Moses. The statutes is what helps them know the difference between the clean and the unclean. says in Ezekiel 44, they will teach my people the difference between the holy and the common, and explain to them the difference between the unclean and the clean. And the problem comes about when they don't do this, when they fail in this role, when we are unable to pass on the ability to distinguish between these things. Ezekiel 22 puts it like this: her priests, her Kohanim, have done violence to my Torah. They have profaned my holy things. They have made no distinction between the holy and the profane, nor have they taught the difference between the unclean and the clean. And so they shut their eyes to my Shabbatot, and so I am profaned among them. The means and the way by which they do violence to the Torah is by failing or being unwilling to make these distinctions, to show and demonstrate and live out the difference of these ways of life. This is the challenging part. This is the challenging reality that we face, and we still face today. At birth, it's impossible really to know, it's impossible for parents to know which path is going to dominate the child's life. This account of Jacob and Esau is supposed to help teach us a lesson, but because we don't really know Jacob, we miss it. And this is the challenge that every family faces in some way or another, because in this case especially, this same family, the same womb, occupied at exactly the same time, can produce children of each way of life. No matter how godly the parents may be, they can produce children of each way of life. And Rebekah didn't know what kind of life Esau would live. The color was kind of one way of revealing that. Nor did she know what kind of life Jacob would live. Now, for those of you who have raised kids, does it necessarily take you very long to figure out kids' personalities and which one's going to be trouble and which one's not? Sometimes it doesn't take very long. Sometimes it doesn't take a long time to figure out which one will be the godly and which one will be the ungodly. But make no mistake about it, we need to understand that Esau was ungodly. And he was ungodly from a very early age. He was very immoral. That was the determination. That's what the Holy Spirit had to say in speaking to the author of Hebrews. We just got out of this. But in Hebrews 12:6, he says, see to it that there is no immoral or godless person like Esau. So he was very ungodly. He was rejecting God and his ways. And he is the epitome of something that my son just described. And he had a talk with some of his friends or some of his group in his apartment complex up there at college. He was talking about the nature of man, or what is the ideal man. He was going into Plato and philosophy and stuff like that. And he is the ideal of, or the epitome of, what Plato described as a tyrannical man. Someone who is a little more than an animal in his nature, in his base, in his desires, in his willingness to say, I don't care about anything else, just what I want. And that's one reason he's the color red, but he's also covered in what? Hair like the fur. So he is depicted almost like an animal in his birth. So Esau is little more than an animal in his desires, and it all plays out in how he takes what he wants without concern of others, without concern of the consequences. So what he wants in the moment is all that matters. And we know a lot of people like that in the world today, don't we? That are going down that same path. The hedonists in that respect. But this plays out even in the bowl of food that he wants because he's hungry. It's an example of just how godless Esau really is. Strangely enough, the food is an example of how godless Esau is. Hebrews 12 puts it like this. See that there is no immoral or godless person like Esau, and the example that was given, he sold his birthright for one meal. You got to ask, well, why is this an example or a demonstration of godlessness? I mean, the food that he gets is not unclean, but it shows how little Esau cares about the things of God. It shows how little he cares about the heritage that was right there for him, that was available for him. See, remember, this is the description that they gave of Esau. It says, when the boys grew up, Esau became a man knowledgeable in hunting. He was an outdoorsman. That's not knocking on people that like to go, hiking or camping or things like that. George, you're off the hook in that respect. But in this sense, this is somebody who is, even as a young man, was rarely to never at home because he was always out and about doing his own thing. He was this hunter. He was a predator. He was a dangerous man who could do whatever he wanted out there, and mom and dad would never know. And the language suggests that he's not just hunting animals for food. The language suggests he's also hunting down people. Out there, Esau did his own thing. He learned his own ways. He had no influence over his character and in his development. He practically was raising himself. And out there, he had little to no responsibility other than what he wanted to do in that particular moment. He was a man of the same nature and character of Nimrod that the scriptures talk about. He was a tyrant. Does that sound like his family at all? No. His family was built on shepherding. And how many of you, when you have animals and things like that, can you just pack up and leave and go off whenever you want to? No. Family or shepherding required mostly staying at home, which required staying with the flock, which required being concerned about the needs of something other than yourself. And of the two boys, it's not Esau, so that means that this is a description of who? This must be a description of Jacob and what kind of man he is. Esau was this man knowledgeable in hunting, this outdoorsman, while Jacob was a mild man remaining in the tent. And those of you who've been here a while know that there's something about that description of Jacob that's wrong. We'll come back to that in a minute. But Jacob stayed home with the tents. That didn't make him a mama's boy. That didn't make him weak. But it demonstrated that the way of life that his family lived was the kind of life that Jacob wanted to live. He was the responsible son. He was the dutiful son. He was the one who went out and took care of the flocks. He was the one who was most influenced by his father Isaac. He was most influenced by his grandfather Abraham. So yes, Abraham was still alive. Abraham was there throughout Jacob and Esau's childhood. But who did Abraham rarely see or have an influence on? Esau. Guess who Abraham could rarely teach, who could rarely pass on wisdom about how to raise and shepherd the sheep? He couldn't teach that stuff to Esau because he was always gone. Guess who Abraham could rarely teach and influence about God and who God is and God's ways? He couldn't influence Esau. So who could Abraham see and influence? He'd see Jacob. Who could Abraham pass on wisdom and teach about shepherding? Jacob. Who could Abraham influence about God and his ways? Jacob. Two nations, two ways of life are on display here. And so when you you realize that that's what's going on here, guess who really cared? Guess who really felt the loss when Abraham died? Jacob did. In fact, traditionally, Esau wasn't even aware of the situation. Traditionally, Esau wasn't aware of his death, and he missed the funeral because he was running around like the heathen animal that it describes him as. Traditionally, that stew, that red stew, the stew of the earth, was a meal cooked during the times of mourning, during Sheva, during the grieving period. And Esau shows up during this time and reveals what he's thinking about, his family, their legacy, the kind of life that he wants for himself. So Jacob, he's cooking the stew, and when Esau came in from the field, he was exhausted. So Esau said to Jacob, please feed me some of this really red stuff because I'm exhausted. That's why he is called Edom. So does Esau have any awareness of what's happening? No, he doesn't care about that stuff. He's hungry. He's famished. He doesn't ask. He doesn't care. And tradition also adds the idea that he's also a bit on the run. Tradition talks about him that he is returning from hunting down and killing Nimrod, another tyrant, because he wants his power, because he wants his authority. Nimrod is who Esau looks up to and wants to be and wants to take his place. And again, tradition even goes on to claim that that Esau takes this cloak from Nimrod, which is supposed to be made from the skins that God first gave to Adam. That's a pretty big deal. And so Esau's on the run. And where is he coming back for safety? Oh yeah, he's coming back home. But that's it. He wants protection. And he's like, just give me what I want. I'm driven by this hunger. I need my strength to defend myself. And guess how old these boys are supposed to be at this time? 15. 15 years old when Abraham dies. And so when someone dies, it's normal to start thinking about the future, about what's going to happen next, about where things are going, what the family's going to be like. Esau, he's thinking about Nimrod's death and what he's just gained or what he hopes to gain. Jacob, the one grieving Abraham's loss and influence, well, he's going to begin thinking about the family and what's going to happen next to the family. He's even going to start to wonder, what's going to happen when Isaac dies? What's going to happen when that comes to pass? What's going to happen because Esau is the one who's supposed to get the double portion as the firstborn? What would that future look like when Esau inherits most of what my father has? That sound like a good future? If Esau gets control of this family, if he gets control of that, if he doesn't have the influence of Abraham, he doesn't know how to raise the sheep, he doesn't know Abraham's God, he doesn't know the way of life that they've been living because he's been off doing his own thing, this would be a disaster because Esau doesn't really want that life at all. He wants power. He wants control. He knows nothing of the God of Abraham and Isaac, nothing about the covenant, nothing about the promises, nothing about the legacy of faith that in the vision that God has that stretches off into the future. Esau doesn't know or care about that stuff. And what happens when the wicked rules? According to Proverbs 29, it says the people groan. They cry out. When the wicked rule, the people groan, they cry out, they suffer, and they perish. So Esau, he's this picture of this way of life. He is merely demanding what he wants in the moment, what's right in front of him, and he would run the family into the ground. So what Jacob proposes is to save the family from the disaster that would be Esau. And Jacob is choosing the right thing. Jacob is living the right way. Jacob is the man of faith who believes the promises and the future that God has been talking about and preparing all of them for. So Jacob said, "Sell your birthright to me today." And Esau said, "Look, I'm about to die. Whatever use is this to me, this birthright? That's not today. That's sometime on the future. My life is today, right now, because if not, I'm going to die." And Jacob said, "Make a pledge to me now." So, immediately, without real hesitation, without real thought of consequence, without real thought of any of that stuff, Esau makes a pledge to him and sold his birthright to Jacob. And then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew, and he ate and drank. Then he got up and took off again. He didn't stick around. He didn't stay to grieve. He didn't stay to be with the family, support anybody. He just left. So Esau despised his birthright. He didn't despise it after he sold it. He really despised it before he sold it. And is there any deceit here? Is there any tricking going on from Jacob? Is he misleading Esau in any way? No. Did he give Esau exactly what he asked for and exactly what he wanted? Yep. Esau got exactly what he asked for. So if Esau feels gypped and ripped off, whose fault is that? That's his own fault. Esau despised his birthright long before he sold it. And so this account of selling it merely shows how little he valued the way of life, how little he wanted the responsibility that comes with being the head of the family. Oh yeah, he wants the wealth. Oh yeah, he wants the blessing, but he doesn't want the roles and he doesn't want the responsibilities. He has a different way of life that he wants to live. So in this moment, when he sells him the birthright to Jacob becomes the rightful firstborn. The one who is the rightful inheritor of the family and the promise. What we need to understand is that in this story, Esau is the deceiver, not Jacob. More so than Jacob. And I'll come back to this in a minute too. For further proof that Esau rejects the ways and the values and the faith of his family, just look at the women that he marries. Without even asking his family. Chapter 26, verse 34 talks about that. I don't have this phrase up here, but it says, when Esau was 40 years old, he took as his wife Judith, the daughter of Beeri the Hittite, and Basemath, the daughter of Elon the Hittite, but they caused bitterness of spirit for Isaac and Rebekah. Again, looking back at how this is understood and told within the Jewish world, tradition says that his marriage was already arranged. There was an agreement that had already been set up that he had wanted nothing to do with, and that he was already arranged with the firstborn of Laban. And who would that be? That's Leah. Because what's weird is Isaac already knows that Laban has daughters. You see that in chapter 28, verse 1. As he calls for Jacob, he blesses him, he commands him and says, don't take a wife from the daughters of Canaan. Get up, go to Padan Aram, to the house of Bethuel, your mother's father, and take yourself a wife from there, from the daughters of Laban, your mother's brother. Now, how would he know that Laban already has daughters that are of the appropriate age for marriage? He would know that because they've already had some contact. So, again, since you know the story, Esau is the one who is the true deceiver. In chapter 27, when Isaac called in Esau to bless him, all of a sudden Esau puts on the role of the suddenly dutiful son. Esau does so knowing that he is not the firstborn legally by inheritance. He does so knowing that he has already sold that birthright, that he is no longer legally in that position, that he should not legally receive the blessing from his father as the firstborn. But does he say anything about it? Nope. Esau is willing to deceive his father Isaac and take it anyway, as if nothing has changed. Again, so who's deceiving who here? Who is the most in the wrong here? I kind of even wonder whether at some point in this life, if Isaac was told that Jacob now owned the birthright, but maybe he just didn't believe it. Maybe he's like, well, I don't know if that's true or not. Because no, Esau would never do that. Because remember, Isaac looked up to Esau. Esau was kind of living that, Isaac was living that life vicariously through Esau about the adventurous one that was able to go off and go on do one of these adventures and do his own thing. Because Isaac never got to do that stuff. He never got to leave the land. He never got to go on adventures where he wasn't with the family. He's like the person who, the athlete who lives vicariously through their son playing sports. But we see Esau's true nature and his true character revealed, and Isaac gets to see this true nature and this character revealed when he doesn't get what he wants. When Esau comes home after going off and hunting and realizes that he doesn't get the blessing, that he lets out this intensely bitter groan, a loud and bitter cry. You see that in chapter 27, verse 34. And the language that's used there is not strong enough for what comes out of Esau's mouth. It's rage. It's a tantrum. It's a bitter and blasphemous rant against his father for being so blind and stupid, and his brother for outsmarting him. So that mask that was the dutiful son has been torn off in front of Isaac. He can hear it for himself. And he hears confirmation that the birthright doesn't really belong to Esau after all. Because he admits it. 27 verse 36. Esau says, "Is this why he was named Jacob, since he has tricked me twice already?" Now, is that true? No. That's a lie. He didn't trick him the first time at all. And so we take Esau's word for this account. When we make Jacob into the bad-natured character that we tend to think, we take Esau's word for it. We believe Esau. That's how I grew up understanding Jacob. But he says, "My birthright he has taken." No, he didn't take it at all. You gave it to him. You sold it to him. But look, now he has taken my blessing. Then he said, "Haven't you saved a blessing for me?" And all of a sudden he's like, "Well, wait a minute, wait. His what? He took your what? Now, how did he get that?" It's a lie that Jacob stole it. But Isaac learns, he gets this confirmation that the birthright has been transferred to Jacob, that he really does have the right of the firstborn, to the point that when he asks for any leftover blessing, when Esau asks for any leftover blessing, Isaac says, no. He has no blessing for Esau that is not tied to who? The blessing any blessing is tied to Jacob. And Isaac sees, he hears this desire to kill his own brother from Esau. Just like Cain was willing to kill Abel. And we are not supposed to be like him. This way of life, this path that Esau goes down, that is not the way that God has for his people. And if we're not supposed to be like Esau in this story, then who are we supposed to be like? Who is supposed to be the example in this story of the two ways of life. Esau represents the ungodly way of life. That means Jacob represents the godly way of life. Yaakov is supposed to be that example. And see, our problem comes when we've been taught to think that Jacob is just as ungodly as Esau, that Yaakov is the trickster, the deceiver. We've been taught that everything that happens to him, especially when he gets up there to Laban, that Laban does to him, oh, he deserves that. We've been taught that Yaakov does not represent the clean, the sacred, the holy, and yet the older Esau will serve the younger Jacob. The ungodly will serve the godly. Isn't that how things are supposed to end up? At the end of time, at the end when the kingdom comes? You look at how Isaac responds in telling him and giving him, what do you have? I don't really have a blessing for you. I gave everything to him, but this is what he says. Isaac answered and said to Esau, behold, I have made him master over you, and all your brothers I've given to him as servants. I've provided him with grain and new wine. What then can I do for you, my son? And Esau said to his father, do you just have one blessing, my father? Bless me too, my father. And Esau lifted up his voice and wept. Hebrews continues this description of Esau like this. See to it that there is no immoral or godless person like Esau, who sold his birthright for one meal. For you know that later, when he wanted to inherit the blessing, he was rejected. He found no chance for repentance, though he begged for it with tears. There's no way to turn this around. There's no way to undo this situation. It's that whole, you make your bed and you're lying in it. This cannot be taken back. This cannot be undone. And we need to understand that that's very true for us. There's many times, there's many situations when we make a choice and we go down a path. Even when we repent, even when we turn back, even when it breaks us and we cry out, it can't be undone what's happened. Many times. But he was rejected. His plea was rejected. Blessing would not come to Esau unless he lives within the role described in the blessing given to Jacob. This is what I made him master over you, and his brothers I've given as servants. Remember Jacob. This is the interesting thing. Remember Jacob was wearing clothes that belonged to who? When he goes in and he's disguised, he goes into Isaac. He's wearing whose clothes? He's wearing Esau's clothes. Esau's favorite clothes, according to verse 15. And for some reason they were kept in his mother's tent. Again, tradition says this could be the garment that he took from Nimrod, made from the skins that God gave to Adam. And now who has them? Jacob does. Tradition goes on to say that this was the coat of many colors that he passes on to who? Joseph. So this is what Isaac blessed Jacob with, and it fits what Nimrod and Esau were hoping to accomplish through their own efforts, through their own domination, through their own viciousness. This is the blessing that Jacob received. May God give you from the dew of the sky, from the fatness of the land, an abundance of grain and new wine. And Isaac, he's the one that when he plants in the land, he receives 100-fold harvest. It says, may peoples serve you and may nations bow down to you. That's what Nimrod wanted to be like. That's what Esau wanted to be like. He says, be master over your brother. May your mother's sons bow down to you. May those who curse you be cursed, and may those who bless you be blessed. Wow, can you imagine if Esau got that? What a mess there would be. But Esau is only going to experience blessing so long as he is living in this. in the blessing given to Jacob. Most of your translations will read, what Isaac has for Esau like this. Isaac said to his father said to him, "Behold, it's away from the land's fatness shall your dwelling be, away from the dew of the sky above. By your sword shall you live, and your brother shall serve you. Your brother shall you serve. But when you tear yourself loose, you will tear his yoke off your neck." And we were talking about this passage last night. Vicki pointed out that it doesn't seem like much of a blessing. If it's away from the fatness of the land, it's away from the water. But the complete Jewish Bible translates it like this. It says, Yitzhak, his father, answered him, "Here, your home will be of the richness of the earth and of the dew of heaven from above. You will live by your sword, and you will serve your brother, but when you break loose, you will shake his yoke off your neck." Well, the ungodly Esau can still experience God's blessing for his life. Where does he experience that? Here. Where is here? Here is now the family that is going to be run by Jacob. Then the faith that is passed on to the generations that follow. That is where Esau will experience the blessing of the richness of the earth in the dew of heaven. That is where all of us will experience the blessing. Under the tent of Jacob, under the umbrella, that extension of the blessing to include those who are fulfilling the blessing. People who serve, nations who bow down to the rule and the way of life that Jacob represents. And when does Esau lose that? When does he live away from the richness of the earth and the dew of heaven? It's when this happens. When you break loose, you will shake his yoke off your neck. When you rebel against this and you don't live in your purpose, you don't live in this blessing, and you pull away from Jacob, guess what? You lose. You lose your portion of that blessing. You lose your place in that blessing. We lose the blessing and the benefit when we throw off Jacob and what he represents. That way of life that he represents. We lose a lot more than we realize. We do so when we say that Jacob is the deceiver, that he is the trickster. Well, believers today who say that about him also are going to be saying negative things about the Torah. They're also going to be saying things like, the Torah is a burden. It's not a way of life for us. I don't want to live like that. But when we say those kind of things, who do we sound more like? Do we sound like Jacob, or do we sound like Esau? We sound like Esau. We have to realize that Abraham lived this life. So did Isaac. And so learned Jacob. Genesis 26. I'm talking about the kind of man that Abraham was. He listened to my voice. He kept my charge, my mitzvot, my decrees, and my instructions, my Torah. That's the kind of influence that Jacob grew up with. He wanted this way of life, and he wanted to live this way of life. He was not just a quiet and a mild man who stayed among the tents. He stayed and learned and lived the wisdom that Abraham had to pass on. That word, quiet or mild, is a variation of that word. It was also used to describe Abraham in Genesis 17. So when Abraham was 99 years old, Adonai appeared to Abraham and said to him, "I am El Shaddai. Continually walk before me, and you will be blameless." That word is tamim. It means complete, whole, or entire, morally sound, wholesome, innocent, having integrity. When it's talking about sacrifices, it means that they are whole, they are acceptable burnt offerings. And it comes from this word, 8552, tamam, which means complete or finished. Okay, so don't lose track of that. Keep that in mind. Because when you get to this passage where it says Jacob was a mild man remaining in the tents, this word is tam. Perfect, complete. It usually means morally pious. There's just one exception. It means undefiled and upright, morally innocent, having integrity. Oh, look, it's from exactly the same word that the one for Abraham was described with. Complete and finished. And then the secondary kind of definition is ordinary or quiet sort of person. You know, this word is used 13 times in the King James, and only one time is it translated as plain. Guess when? Talking about Jacob. And why do they translate it like that? In what is, you know, in every other instance, this is a positive word, but here about Jacob, it's at best neutral. You know, neither good nor bad, but it's supposed to be good. But see, we think we know Jacob. We've been taught that he's no better than Esau. That so morally good and upright, you know, that can't be Jacob. But look how the same word is used elsewhere. First place, or one place that you'll find it, is Job chapter 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and now that man was quiet and mild. That makes sense? But it makes sense to translate that about Job. Or is it appropriate to say he was blameless and upright, and he feared God and shunned evil? Same word. Or the next one, Psalm 37. Notice the quiet and mild man, and watch the upright, for the man of shalom has a future. Would that make sense? No. But notice the man of integrity, and watch the upright, for the man of shalom has a future. Does Jacob have a future? Is he a man of peace? Yes. Or look at this one. This is Proverbs 29. He says, bloodthirsty people hate a man of integrity. Would it make sense to say bloodthirsty people hate a mild and quiet man? No, if you're going to be mild and quiet, you're going to lay there and take it, man, they'll love you. You surrender, which is kind of typically how we understand it. Yeah, go ahead. We'll like you. It's the man of integrity that the bloodthirsty people hate and seek the soul of the upright. Now, who does that sound like? Who is the bloodthirsty person who does the hating? Isn't that Esau? And who is the man of integrity? Isn't that Jacob? You see that play out. So Esau bore a grudge against Jacob because of the blessing with which his father had blessed him. And Esau said in his heart, let the time for mourning my father draw near, so that I can kill my brother Jacob. Esau is the bloodthirsty man. Esau is the one who wants to kill his brother. He wants to kill the man of integrity. And Isaac saw this and heard this for himself. He saw through the deception of Esau and refused to give him the rest of the blessing that he still had available, because it was no longer available for Esau. It was for the one who had the rights of the firstborn. Because Isaac did bless Jacob. He blessed him, knowing full well who he was, with his eyes fully open. And where Isaac had hesitated before because he suspected something all along. Are you really my son Esau? Well, come here, my son, let me feel you. He hesitated, he suspected, but this second time he held nothing back. Remember this? He calls for Jacob, he blesses him, talks about not taking a wife from the daughters of Canaan, but go to Laban. Then he says this, now may El Shaddai bless you, may the Almighty bless you, and make you fruitful and multiply you, so that you will become an assembly of peoples. Why didn't he say that last time? And may he give you the blessing of Abraham. Why didn't he say that last time? To you and to your seed with you, that you may take possession of the land and of your sojourn, which God gave to Abraham. Well, wait a minute. If he still had this to say, why didn't he give that to Esau? It wasn't his. Isaac blessed Jacob, this time with the full invocation of Abraham, with the full inclusion of the promises of God. Can you imagine if Esau had gotten this? But it couldn't be his anymore, because it's connected to the rights of the firstborn, and that blessing was already given, and they could not be separated. They could not be changed, no matter how much he cried about it. Because Esau would only use it for himself. Esau would only use it for his own benefit. He would become the greatest tyrant on the planet with all of that. But Jacob, he had the character, he had the integrity to live responsibly with the blessing. And if you want to truly live and experience the blessing of God, you need to be a person of character and integrity. Because the rest of the narrative about Jacob's life as an experience lets us see that this is how God views Jacob. There is never any condemnation from God. God promises to bless Jacob, to protect Jacob, to return Jacob to this land, and to be his God. Everything else establishes Jacob's integrity as an example of faith that we as God's people are supposed to emulate. He is renamed the Prince of God. And as the King James puts it, really does the best job. And he said unto him, what is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, thy name shall be called Jacob, called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and with men, and hast prevailed. Sarah is within the middle there of that, which means prince. So as a prince, Jacob is working and operating in the power and the authority, in the protection, in the blessing of God. And that is how he prevails against men like Laban, against men like Esau, and eventually like Pharaoh in the later years. He is an example of the clean living among the unclean, the sacred among the secular, the holy among the profane. He is the two nations and the two ways of life. These two are the examples of that. So we haven't been looking to Jacob as an example for life in this world, but we should be. He should be, because the world really hasn't changed. Do the bloodthirsty still pursue after men and women of integrity? Yes. See, this desire on Esau's part to kill Jacob is no different from the spirit that within Cain and his descendants, who hate those who live uprightly and pleasing to the Father, that led up to Noah. That spirit has not died. The ungodly still hate and want to punish or kill the righteous. It will continue to escalate until as the times grow short. The ungodly will still seek to punish the godly. They're going to still seek to kill them, to throw them in jail, to make them subject to their authority, to fire them from their jobs, to make you unable to buy and sell. I mean, we're not seeing any of that, are we? And what example did Jacob provide with such a brother in such a world? Well, in this case, he worked to prevent the ungodly from taking power. He knew that that would be a disaster. That may require some of us who love God and his ways to maybe run for office, like school board, city council, legislature, to prevent the ungodly from taking hold of it. Because as we're seeing, when they do, when the ungodly rises to those positions, they come after the godly and try to subject them, even to the point of killing. And it means making the family of faith an essential element when finding a bride or a husband. Because it's not like Jacob didn't have a lot of options when he was among the Canaanites. And he went back to the family. That's another example of how to live in this world. It may require us to work faithfully, but even shrewdly in the world of the ungodly, like when Jacob was serving under Laban. It may mean being a blessing to the ungodly while you're with them, but not to be very surprised when they try to take as much of God's blessing from you as possible. And so keep working to keep as much of God's blessing as possible. There may come to a point when the godly will have to even take their children and leave and trust in the Father's protection. There are many elements of Jacob's life of how to live as the godly in an ungodly world. But who shall prevail? Who overcomes? It's our King. It's the true firstborn. Firstborn of all creation. The one who gave his life for us, the one who sits in power and authority on the throne of grace. We have power with God, and so with him we are able to prevail. That is the future that we must hold on to, no matter what we see and what we face in this world. We must hold on to that truth and continue to live and walk in the way of life that follows in the example, in that legacy that even Jacob has provided. It's a message that we need to continue to hear, the message that we need to continue to